she was called the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. Magazine covers fought for her face. Directors built entire films around those remarkable green eyes, that perfect bone structure, that otherworldly elegance that seemed to belong to a different, more refined era. When she walked into a room, conversation stopped. When she appeared on screen, audiences forgot to breathe. But Gene Tierney's beauty was a curse disguised as a blessing, a gift that brought only suffering, a face that everyone wanted to possess and no one could protect. In 1943, at a Hollywood canteen where stars entertained soldiers heading off to war, a young woman broke through the crowd to embrace her. The fan was feverish, clearly ill, her skin hot to the touch, but she was desperate, desperate beyond reason to meet her idol. She pressed her face against Gene's, kissed her cheek, confessed breathlessly that she had broken quarantine at a naval hospital just to see her favorite actress. Gene smiled graciously, as she always did. She was pregnant at the time, 4 months along with her first child, radiant with the promise of motherhood. She thought nothing of the encounter. A sick fan, a moment of contact, a memory that would fade by morning. She should have thought everything of it. That kiss carried rubella, German measles, a disease that meant little to adults, a rash, a fever, a week of discomfort, but devastated the unborn with ruthless efficiency. When Gene's daughter Daria was born months later, the damage was catastrophic beyond comprehension. Deaf, blind in one eye, severely mentally disabled, a beautiful child trapped in a body and mind that would never develop beyond infancy, never speak a word, never recognize her own mother. The fan had stolen Gene's future with a single kiss, and Gene Tierney would spend the rest of her life paying for someone else's desperate act of misguided love. This is the story of the woman who had everything and lost it all because a stranger wanted to touch her. The story of beauty that brought only suffering. The story of a mother who could not save her child, a wife who could not hold her marriages together, a mind that eventually shattered under the weight of guilt and grief, and a sorrow that had no bottom. Hollywood's most beautiful woman became Hollywood's most broken, and no one could look away. Gene Eliza Tierney was born on November 19, 1920 in Brooklyn, New York, into a world of privilege and expectation that most Americans of the era could barely imagine. Her father, Howard Tierney, was a successful insurance broker with social ambitions that extended far beyond his business dealings. Her mother, Belle, was a former physical education teacher who had traded her career for the role of society wife and stage mother with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign. From the beginning, Gene was groomed for something extraordinary. Not ordinary success, extraordinary success. Not simple beauty, legendary beauty. Not a good marriage, a great one. Her parents saw in their daughter the raw material for greatness, and they set about shaping it with the relentless precision of sculptors working marble, accepting no flaws, tolerating no resistance. She attended private schools in Connecticut and New York, institutions where the daughters of wealth learned deportment and languages and the subtle arts of social navigation. She spent a year at a finishing school in Switzerland, perfecting the charm and conversation skills that would serve her in drawing rooms and on red carpets alike. She was presented to society at 18, a debutante whose photographs from the era show a beauty so striking that it seems almost aggressive, almost unfair to everyone else in the frame. Her parents had planned meticulously for her to marry well, to become the ornament of some wealthy family, to continue the upward trajectory they had begun. But Gene had other ideas forming in her mind, ideas that would scandalize her social set and enrage her father. She had seen the movies. She had felt the pull of the screen, that strange magic that transformed ordinary people into gods. She wanted to act. Her father was furious. Acting was not a respectable profession for a young woman of her class. It meant exposure, vulnerability, the kind of public scrutiny that respectable families avoided at all costs. It meant being looked at by strangers, desired by strangers, touched, even if only with their eyes, by people who had no right to touch her. But Gene persisted with a quiet determination that surprised everyone who knew her as compliant, and eventually her parents relented, on the condition that they would manage her career themselves. It was a bargain that would define her life. Gene Tierney would always be managed. By her parents, by her studios, by her husbands, by her doctors. She would never fully belong to herself. Hollywood noticed her immediately. How could it not? In 1940, she signed a contract with 20th Century Fox, and within 2 years she was one of the most sought-after actresses in the industry. Her face graced magazine covers from coast to coast. Her name appeared above titles in letters that grew larger with each film. Directors competed for her attention, crafted projects around her presence, shaped their visions to accommodate her remarkable face. But it was Laura, released in 1944, that made her immortal. She played the title character, a woman believed dead, whose portrait haunts the detective investigating her murder. The role required her to be simultaneously present and absent, real and idealized, a fantasy that men projected their desires onto rather than a flesh-and-blood woman with needs of her own. It was, in many ways, the story of her own life. Always watched, never truly seen, always desired, never truly known. The film was a sensation that exceeded everyone's expectations. Gene Tierney became not just a star but an icon, the embodiment of a certain kind of feminine mystery that audiences found irresistible. Critics praised her beauty in terms that bordered on worship. Audiences treated her image as something sacred. Hollywood had found its new goddess. But by the time Laura premiered to rapturous reviews, Gene Tierney was already drowning in private tragedy that no amount of public adulation could touch. In 1941, Gene married Oleg Cassini, a dashing costume designer who would later become famous as Jackie Kennedy's personal couturier. He was handsome in a continental way, charming with the ease of European aristocracy, and completely devoted to Gene with an intensity that felt like rescue. Their romance seemed plucked from one of her films, the beautiful actress and the elegant artist, building a life of glamour and passion against the backdrop of war. The problems began almost immediately, seeping into their happiness like water through cracks. Gene's parents despised Oleg with a hatred that bordered on obsession. They considered him beneath their daughter, a working designer rather than a man of independent means, an immigrant whose accent marked him as foreign, a man whose family had lost their fortune in the Russian Revolution and who therefore represented downward mobility rather than the ascent they had planned. They did everything in their power to destroy the marriage, including reporting Oleg to immigration authorities in hopes of having him deported. Gene found herself caught between the family that had shaped her entire existence and the husband she loved. The stress was immense and unrelenting. She developed anxiety that would plague her for years, manifesting in sleeplessness and nervousness and a constant sense of impending catastrophe. She began to doubt herself, her choices, her ability to navigate a world that suddenly seemed designed specifically to crush her, but she stayed with Oleg. She loved him, and love, she still believed then, could conquer anything. And in 1943 she discovered she was pregnant with their first child. For a brief, shimmering moment, everything seemed possible. The career was thriving beyond her parents' most ambitious dreams. The marriage was holding despite the pressure. A child was coming to complete their family. Gene Tierney, at 22, appeared to have achieved what every woman of her era was supposed to want: success, love, and motherhood, all wrapped in the most beautiful face in Hollywood. Then came the kiss. The Hollywood Canteen was a club on Cahuenga Boulevard, where stars entertained servicemen during World War II. It was considered patriotic duty of the highest order, celebrities mingling with soldiers, signing autographs, dancing, pouring coffee, providing a few hours of escape before young men shipped off to face death in Europe and the Pacific. Everyone participated. Everyone wanted to contribute to the war effort. Gene, pregnant and glowing with the particular radiance that expectant mothers sometimes possess, attended regularly. She believed in the cause with genuine conviction. She wanted to contribute something beyond her image. She had no idea that her contribution would cost her everything she valued. The young woman who broke through the crowd that night was a fan with a fever and a determination that bordered on dangerous obsession. She had been quarantined at a naval hospital with rubella, German measles, but she had escaped. She had walked out against medical orders, against all reason, because she could not bear to miss the chance to meet Gene Tierney. Gene was gracious, as she always was with fans. She accepted the embrace, the kiss on the cheek, the fevered declarations of admiration and devotion. She did not know that the woman was contagious with a disease that attacked the unborn. She did not know that rubella in the first trimester of pregnancy could cause catastrophic, irreversible damage to a developing child. No one knew in 1943 just how dangerous such exposure could be. The medical understanding was not there yet. When Daria was born on October 15, 1943, the damage was immediately apparent to everyone in the delivery room. The baby was beautiful. She had inherited her mother's remarkable features, that same bone structure that would one day break hearts, but something was terribly, obviously wrong. She did not respond to sounds, her eyes did not track movement properly, her development, even in those first hours, seemed frozen. The diagnosis came gradually over weeks and months, each revelation worse than the last. Daria was deaf, she was partially blind, one eye functioning, one dark. She was severely cognitively impaired, what doctors of the era called mentally retarded, a term that carried no delicacy. She would never speak a single word. She would never read or write. She would never care for herself in any capacity. She would remain, mentally and emotionally, an infant for the rest of her life. Gene Tierney had given birth to a tragedy. The Rubella connection was not confirmed until later, when doctors pieced together Gene's exposure at the Hollywood Canteen with the specific pattern of Daria's disabilities. The timing aligned perfectly. The symptoms matched the known effects of Rubella on fetal development. Gene learned, with the certainty of medical diagnosis, that a single kiss from a sick fan had destroyed her daughter's future. The knowledge nearly destroyed her. "I wanted to find that woman and kill her," Gene wrote in her autobiography decades later, the rage still fresh on the page. "I wanted to understand how someone could be so selfish, so reckless, so desperate for a moment with a stranger, that she would risk a child's entire life. I wanted answers. I wanted justice. I wanted someone to pay. But there was no one to punish. The fan had never been identified. She had disappeared into the crowd, into the anonymity of wartime Los Angeles, leaving behind only the devastation she had caused." Gene was left with guilt and rage, and nowhere to direct either emotion. They turned inward instead, eating her alive. She blamed herself with the relentless logic of grief. If she had not gone to the canteen that night, if she had not been so gracious, so welcoming, so willing to let strangers touch her, if she had recognized the illness, the fever, the flush, the trembling, and stepped away, the what-ifs tormented her, an endless loop of recrimination that played in her mind for years, for decades, until the day she died. Daria was eventually institutionalized. Gene and Oleg could not care for a child who required constant supervision, who would never recognize her parents, who would never know the life that had been stolen from her before she drew her first breath. The decision was agonizing, a wound that never healed. Gene visited when she could, but each visit was agony, looking into her daughter's beautiful, empty face and seeing the monument to her own failure. Her marriage to Oleg did not survive. How could it? The child they had created together had become a source of unbearable pain, a reminder of loss every time they looked at each other, every time they did not look at each other. They divorced in 1952, leaving Gene alone with her grief and her guilt and her fading career. After the divorce, Gene Tierney tried to rebuild with the determination of someone who has no other choice. She continued acting, though the roles were fewer, and the magic seemed diminished. The glow that had made her luminous on screen had been replaced by something darker, something haunted, that audiences could not quite identify, but definitely felt. She remarried in 1960, briefly and disastrously, to a Texas oil heir who proved to be controlling and cruel, who wanted a trophy wife rather than a partner, who saw her fragility as something to exploit rather than protect. That marriage lasted less than 2 years before she fled. And then there was John Kennedy. They met in 1946 when Kennedy was a young congressman from Massachusetts and Gene was at the height of her fame. The attraction was immediate and intense, the kind of chemistry that ignores circumstances and consequences. Kennedy was charming in a way that seemed almost unfair, brilliant in conversation and completely unsuitable, a Catholic from a family that would never accept a divorced Protestant actress, a man whose political ambitions required a very different kind of wife. They conducted an affair that lasted on and off for several years. Kennedy introduced Gene to his father, Joe Kennedy, who made the family's position brutally clear. A Kennedy could not marry a woman with Gene's history, the divorce, the institutionalized child, the mental instability that was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone who knew her. The Kennedy brand was about perfection, and Gene Tierney, for all her beauty, was damaged goods. Gene understood. She always understood when she was being rejected. She had been raised to understand such things, to accept her place in hierarchies she did not control. She stepped aside with grace and watched Kennedy marry Jacqueline Bouvier in 1953. She watched him rise to the Senate, to the presidency, to the heights of power. She watched from a distance as the man she had loved achieved everything while she continued to fall. The rejection by the Kennedy family broke something in her that had been fracturing for years. She had lost her daughter, her marriages, and now this, the final confirmation that she was too damaged to be loved by anyone who had a choice. By the mid-1950s, Gene Tierney's mental health had deteriorated beyond concealment. She suffered from what was then called depression, but was likely a complex combination of clinical depression and post-traumatic stress, the accumulated weight of Daria's condition, 2 failed marriages, the Kennedy rejection, and the constant pressure of maintaining a public image while privately collapsing into pieces. In 1957, she checked herself into a psychiatric hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. It was the first of many stays over the following years. The treatment was brutal by modern standards, electroconvulsive therapy, which was administered repeatedly over months, which sent electricity through her brain to reset her neural patterns, which left gaps in her memory that would never be filled. "I lost years," she said later, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone describing something too large for emotion. "Whole years of my life that I cannot recall. Faces of people I knew, conversations I had, experiences I lived through, all erased. The treatment was supposed to help me, but it also took part of me away forever. The electroshock did provide temporary relief from the crushing depression, but it also damaged her, leaving her confused and disoriented, her famous memory for dialogue impaired, her ability to work diminished. The most beautiful woman in Hollywood had become a fragile ghost of herself, wandering through days she would not remember. She attempted suicide at least once. The details were kept private by the standards of the era, but the fact of it was widely known in Hollywood. Gene Tierney, the perfect face, the perfect body, the perfect image, had tried to end her own life because living had become unbearable. The industry that had worshipped her now whispered about her. She was difficult. She was unstable. She was a risk that studios increasingly declined to take, an insurance liability, a reminder that beauty could not protect anyone from anything. Gene Tierney essentially retired from acting in the early 1960s. There were occasional appearances, a film here, a television show there, but the career that had defined her youth was over. She was not yet 45 years old, and she would live another 3 decades in the quiet that followed fame. She married a 3rd time in 1960 to a Texas oil magnate named W. Howard Lee. This marriage would last, not because it was passionate or romantic in the way her earlier marriages had been, but because Lee provided something Gene desperately needed: stability. He was wealthy enough that she never had to work again. He was patient with her fragility. He was willing to care for a damaged woman whose beauty still flickered, even as her mind struggled to maintain its grip on the present. They lived quietly in Houston, far from Hollywood, far from the industry that had both created and destroyed her. Gene gardened in the Texas heat. She painted watercolors of flowers and landscapes. She read voraciously, losing herself in other people's stories. She tried to construct a life that did not require her to be Gene Tierney, movie star that allowed her to be simply Gene, a woman like any other. But the past would not stay buried. The past never does. In 1979, Gene published her autobiography. The book was startling in its honesty. She wrote openly about Daria, about the Rubella, about her mental illness and the electroshock treatments that had erased pieces of her memory. She wrote about Kennedy without naming him directly, but everyone who had followed the gossip columns knew exactly who the young congressman had been. The book brought her back into public consciousness, but not in the way she might have hoped. People were fascinated by her tragedies, by the fall from grace, by the beautiful woman who had suffered so much. She became an object of morbid curiosity rather than admiration, a cautionary tale rather than an inspiration. Years after the Hollywood Canteen incident, Gene attended a party, one of the few social occasions she allowed herself, where a woman approached her, smiling with the eager recognition of a devoted fan. "I'm so happy to see you," the woman said, reaching for Gene's hands. "You don't remember me, but we met during the war. I'm the one who broke quarantine to meet you. I had rubella, but I just couldn't miss the chance to see you. It was worth it. You were so beautiful, so gracious to take time with me." The woman had no idea what she had done. She had never connected her impulsive, selfish act with the child born damaged months later. She stood there beaming, expecting gratitude for her devotion, waiting to be thanked for loving Gene Tierney enough to risk everything for a moment of contact. Gene said nothing. What could she say? That this woman had destroyed her daughter, that a single moment of fan worship had cost a child her entire life, that Gene had spent decades wondering who the stranger was, imagining confronting her, demanding answers that did not exist. She walked away. She never saw the woman again, but the encounter haunted her for the rest of her life. The casual cruelty of fate, the randomness of tragedy, the unbearable reality that the woman who had ruined everything did not even know what she had done, would never know, would live and die believing she had simply met her favorite actress. Gene Tierney spent her last decades in relative peace, if not happiness. Her husband, Howard Lee, provided the stability she needed. Her surviving daughter, Christina, from her marriage to Oleg Cassini, remained close, a living reminder that not everything had been lost. Daria continued to live in an institution, a permanent reminder of what had been stolen, visited when Gene could bear to make the journey. The industry that had forgotten her occasionally remembered. In 1985, she received a tribute at the San Sebastian Film Festival in Spain, a recognition of her contribution to cinema that came decades too late to heal anything. She attended, frail but still beautiful at 64, still possessed of those extraordinary green eyes that had launched 1,000 fantasies. She watched clips from Laura, from Leave Her to Heaven, from the films that had made her famous. She saw herself as she had been, young, luminous, unbroken. She saw the woman she had lost and would never recover. In her final years, Gene struggled with emphysema, the result of decades of smoking that had seemed glamorous once and now extracted its price. Her body failed gradually, the way her mind had failed all those years before. She became increasingly housebound, increasingly dependent on Howard's care, increasingly a memory of a memory. On November 6, 1991, Gene Tierney died in Houston, Texas. She was 70 years old. The obituaries called her a Hollywood legend. They mentioned Laura. They mentioned her beauty. Some mentioned her struggles with mental illness, treating it as a footnote to her glamour. Few mentioned Daria, who would outlive her mother by nearly 2 decades, dying in 2010, still in the institution where she had spent most of her life, still unaware that she had ever had a mother who loved her. Walk into any classic film retrospective today, watch Laura. Watch those green eyes fill the screen, that face that launched 1,000 sighs. Watch the woman who seemed to have everything. Beauty, talent, fame, love, and know what waited for her beyond the frame. Gene Tierney's story is not just a tragedy of one woman. It is a meditation on the cruelty of chance, on the price of fame, on the way beauty can become a prison. She was loved for her face, and her face brought her nothing but suffering. Fans who adored her image destroyed her life. An industry that worshipped her appearance discarded her when her mind faltered. In one of her final interviews, Gene was asked what she wanted to be remembered for. She thought for a long moment, her famous face now lined with age and loss. "I want people to know I was more than a face," she said. "I had a mind, a heart, a life that went far beyond what they saw on screen. I loved deeply. I lost terribly. I survived things that should have killed me." She paused. Her eyes, still green, still remarkable, went somewhere distant. "And I want them to know about Daria, my daughter, the child who never had a chance. I want them to remember that she existed, that she was beautiful, that she was innocent. She did nothing wrong. She was simply unlucky enough to be my daughter." Her voice broke. "I would trade all of it, the movies, the fame, the beauty everyone wanted, for one conversation with my child, for one moment of recognition in her eyes, for one word." She never got that moment. She never got that word. That is the untold story of Gene Tierney. The most beautiful woman in Hollywood was destroyed by a kiss from a stranger. A moment of fan devotion, intended as worship, delivered as plague, stole everything that mattered: a child's future, a mother's sanity, a life that looked perfect from the outside and was shattered beyond repair within. Gene Tierney graced the covers of magazines. She starred in films that are still watched and studied. She was loved by a future president, desired by millions, envied by every woman who saw her face. None of it saved her. None of it could save Daria. The next time you watch Laura, the next time you marvel at those eyes, that face, that impossible beauty, remember what you now know. Remember the kiss. Remember Daria. Remember the price of being public property. That is the shadow behind the icon. That is the truth behind the beauty. And now you know.